And I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to the high-level panel on multinational enterprises and women's empowerment. We're going to start. I am going to pass over to Mrs. Isabel Durant, Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, to introduce this panel for us. Ms. Durant.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. I'm very happy to be with you today and to welcome you to this high-level panel on multinational enterprises and women empowerment. So UNCTAD's innovative work on women empowerment and gender equality is a testimony of our commitment to the global development agenda and to shaping a more inclusive post-pandemic world. Our fifth ministerial conference has just concluded last week, and the outcome document calls on UNCTAD to continue its efforts on gender equality for sustainable development. The conference included an inaugural Gender and Development Forum with representatives from governments, the private sector, and civil society, academics, activists, and very strong activists, I can assure you, and also entrepreneurs. They urge member states to rethink approaches to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda. This year, UNCTAD published a report which examined the gender dimension of one of the key driving forces of globalization, foreign direct investment, and the role of multinational enterprises and the private sector for gender equality in developing countries. Let me gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which enabled us to produce this report on multinational enterprises and the international transmission of gender policies and practices. This report is the first to present empirical evidence on the indirect spillover effects to local firms and labor markets. It includes case studies from 5 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It outlines how governments and other stakeholders can ensure that foreign investment by multinational translates into real benefit for women. An important finding of the report is that multinational enterprises bear the potential to improve gender equality. In addition to the impact of local productivity and income through technological spillovers and direct employment in foreign affiliates, MNEs can influence the host economy by transferring best practice policies towards female employees. MNEs' adoption of explicit non-discrimination policies ensuring equality in hiring practices, pay, and promotion opportunities across their networks of affiliates is an important starting point for a positive impact. Moreover, MNE's transparency and the adoption of international reporting standards on measurable social indicators across genders and geographies is also key to positive gender outcomes. However, a clear message from the report is that these positive outcomes are not automatic, unfortunately. Policymakers, both in host and sending countries of FDI, as well as a multitude of stakeholders, have a role to play to achieve a more equal outcome. One message we would like to emphasize is the importance of involving the private sector to achieve SDG 5. Creating partnerships with MNEs is particularly effective as they work on large scale, have a worldwide reach, and thereby have the potential for extensive impact. So, ladies and gentlemen, ensuring the inclusion of women's talents, skills, experience, and energies requires the concerted actions of the business sector, policymakers, and the civil society. At the global level, despite continuous progress towards an inclusive society and economy, gender discrimination, inequality, and poverty are still widespread. We still have a long way to go to achieve SDG 5. We know that the economic and social effect of the pandemic have fallen disproportionately on women. First, women are more exposed to vulnerabilities and are more likely to lose their jobs than men because their participation in the labor market is often in the form of temporary and part-time employment. Second, women are often less entitled than men to social protection, as eligibility frequently depends upon formal employment. And third, women, particularly women with young children, are more likely to take on most additional care work due to the closure of schools and daycare and centers, which eventually further reduce their employment rates. The pandemic risks reversing decades of progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment. The challenge posed by COVID-19 and the efforts towards recovery could be used as an opportunity to lay institutional foundation for women empowerment and gender equality. Promoting a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery requires addressing gender-based inequalities embedded in social norms and labor markets. This means that macroeconomic policies, including investment, even if it's not obvious, including investment, social and labor market policies, should embrace gender-responsive recovery actions and policy tools. In this vein, we also commend the work of UN Women's Economic Empowerment Principle that seek to promote and demonstrate corporate commitments to gender equality. We will continue working with partners through our different programs and frameworks to address all aspects through which foreign investment can impact gender equality. In addition to research and technical assistance, UNCTAD will continue convening the multi-stakeholders community to debate this issue, particularly through its quadrennial ministerial conference and the biennial World Investment Forum, which is now ongoing. So I wish us a successful discussion and look forward to continue expanding UNCTAD's work and initiative to mainstream gender into trade and investment policies and practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn now to the keynote address, please, of His Excellency, Mr. Andres Valenciano, the Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica, and ask for his remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Eden. On behalf of the government of Costa Rica, it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to UNCTAD for organizing this event. And obviously to our fellow participants, it's a pleasure to be here with you, in this case, to share the gender equality strategy that we launched from the trade sector. It's a real honor for me to present here. But first, I need to be very clear that this strategy has been built by a fantastic team of women who are the real driving force behind this initiative that I'm about to share. As a minister and as a man in a position of power, I know that it's my responsibility to be a good ally, to make sure that I listen and allow women's voices and perspectives to be really at the center of this type of effort. So I just hope that I'm a good messenger today in that regard. As you may know, Costa Rica is a small country, but we are big in terms of our goals and aspirations. And since many, many years ago, we've made sustainability a core pillar of our development model. And that also includes our efforts in trade, in foreign direct investment, and in export promotions. And obviously with the trade negotiations that we have with countries all around the world. But just as important as sustainability, inclusion has been a key driver of our sector for many years now. In that sense, we see gender equality not only as a compliance of SDG number 5, but as a cross-cutting issue that is required to achieve all SDGs. As the Secretary just mentioned, we must work together to mainstream gender all across the goals related to the SDGs. We believe and we share that UNCTAD's vision of including women in trade and businesses is key to the economic recovery, but also of every other discussion moving forward around economic development. Because we realize that in Costa Rica, as in many other countries around the world, there has been progress, and it's important to celebrate it. But it's also important to recognize that much remains to be done. We need to recognize that there are still many barriers preventing the equal access to education, to entrepreneurship, to employment opportunities, And the only way to make significant progress is if we work in real close partnership with the private sector, with civil society, with the media. And this is a whole of society's endeavor. And it is precisely in this context that we recently launched a gender equality strategy as a public-private collaboration of high level in order to reduce gender gaps. And the purpose of this coordinated effort is to empower and connect women to the opportunities derived from international trade, but also to serve as an example to other sectors and to other ministries who are working to implement public policies in order to promote gender equality. This gender equality strategy is based on three big pillars: influence and public policy, employability, and exports and linkages. And that's why our three key institutions that we have in Costa Rica are playing a role in this. First, as in the Ministry of Foreign Trade, we are in charge of influence, public policy, and the regulatory framework. CINDE, which is our investment promotion agency, has been in charge of employability and making sure that multinational enterprises contribute to this cause. And then we have Procomer, which is our export promotion agency, which is in charge of making sure that more companies that are led by women have the opportunity to link to global value chains and become exporters themselves. So this means that all three institutions have been working together on this gender equality strategy. And very importantly, and I want to underline this, is that we have set concrete indicators. We have allocated resources behind them because we want to demonstrate that we are, like they say, walking the talk, not just paying lip services to this movement. We are actually putting resources and time in order to achieve these very ambitious goals that we have. And we expect this will lead to substantial improvement in our business environment because this will allow us to create job opportunities for women, to increase exports of the companies that are led by women, and to continue that diversification of exports that have made Costa Rica a very successful model in that regard. And what do we want to accomplish with our strategy? Is basically four key objectives. One is we want to contribute to the overall ending of discrimination against women and girls. We want to ensure full participation in leadership roles and decision-making levels. We want to enhance the use of technology to promote women's empowerment and to adopt and strengthen policies and laws that have mainstream gender and it will facilitate the other three key objectives. We understand that our role from the public sector has to be to set the right regulations, the right incentives to promote women's empowerment. But we also need the private sector to have a fair and transparent hiring, promotion, payment policies in their workplace. And we have been working very closely with the private sector, particularly with the multinational enterprises, to understand their needs, their barriers, as the barriers they face as they carry out the efforts to include more women in the organizations. And I'm very proud to mention in that sense that in Costa Rica, multinational enterprises have been at the forefront of these efforts. For example, during the year 2020, 49% of the new jobs created by multinational enterprises were occupied by women. And this adds to the already 42% of managerial positions of multinational companies in the services sector are already held by women. And we celebrate this, and we understand that this is there's still much to be done, but it is also an example of how we can definitely work together to remove the barriers and allow women to get formal jobs and contribute to the overall development of our country. Our experience in that regard confirms what research has been saying for many years. This is a very strategic way of generating jobs, of increasing productivity, of launching economic development. But it is also important to remember that it is an issue of human rights. It is a moral imperative which should drive both public policy, should drive investment decisions, and that we should all work together to making sure that this is at the forefront of those discussions. Finally, I would like to close my remarks saying that we are fully committed to continue working with multinational enterprises, with international organizations such as UNCTAD, to share best practices, to learn from others, and to make sure that we are all working together to closing the gender gaps. And when I say that we are all working together, I also mean men. We need to include men in the conversation because, as you know, historically, because of the many reasons that we have understood throughout the years, men are disproportionately have leading roles in both the private sector and sometimes still in the public sector. And if they are the ones making decisions at those levels, we need them to be part of allies. We need them to be convinced, aware of the challenges that women face while picking a career, while getting a job, while getting promoted in their career paths. Because at the end of the day, this needs to be a whole heart effort from everyone in society in order to make significant progress. So we look forward to sharing more ideas in this regard with you, and really happy to be here to share the experience in Costa Rica in this sense. Thank you.
Mr. Valenciano, thank you so much for these insightful remarks. I'm going to hold the questions I have for you to the open panel session, if that's okay with you. I'd like to turn now to Professor Ann Harrison, who's Dean of the Haas Business School at Berkeley, and ask Professor Harrison, could you start, I know you've done a lot of work on multinational firms and gender issues. What do we know about multinationals and gender?
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak today at the World Investment Forum 2021. As you mentioned, I will start by drawing on a review that I did that was commissioned by the Brookings Institution with the provocative title, "Do MNCs Exploit Foreign Workers?" And I just want to mention that the study was completed with a colleague at Berkeley Haas, David Levine, and also with Emma Aisbett, Jason Scores, and Jed Silver. So before I turn to today's topic, I just want to talk about how we answer that question of whether MNCs exploit workers. We use several definitions of exploitation. One definition is paying below market work wages. Another measure would be whether a firm violates legal or ethical standards, such as discrimination against women. In our work, we're going to review the evidence on both types of exploitation. So what do we find? Well, on compensation, if you don't control for a lot of covariates, what research suggests is that multinationals pay a bit more than purely domestic employers. Now, that's because on average, multinationals, they tend to hire more educated employees, and they're often really big employers. And we know that larger firms tend to pay higher wages. But if you control for observable differences in firm characteristics and worker characteristics, then this gap shrinks and is largely erased. Now, what if we look beyond relative wages and just focus on adhering to objective measures of human rights? Now, using this alternative definition, there's really no consistent evidence that multinationals or their suppliers treat workers better or worse than their domestically owned peers. What the evidence really points to is the importance of a multinational company's country of origin, its home country, and where it is operating globally, which is its host country. So for example, an MNE whose home country is Germany or Sweden, where labor rights are strong, will typically treat workers in the host country more favorably than a multinational coming from a home country where labor rights might be weak or enforcement is poor. So for a consumer, knowing that a multinational produced a product doesn't tell us a lot about the living standards or human rights of the workers who made it, but often the home country or the nation of origin of the multinational is a much more valid signal. Now, while policy and activism aimed at multinationals can improve working conditions, that's not the most powerful approach. Policy and activism may be more effective with multinationals because they're larger, they're better known to global consumers, they're subject to stricter standards than local firms are in developing countries. But passing measures that seek to improve the enforcement of labor standards and gender equality across all companies, whether or not the firm is domestic or foreign-based, could have much larger aggregate effects. So those are the broad themes of our research review. We also review the literature on discrimination and treatment of women by multinational firms, which I know is the main topic of interest today. In many countries, women face substantial discrimination in the home and the workplace. Female workers at suppliers for multinationals in many nations report recurrent violations of their rights. Examples include verbal and physical abuse by supervisors, sexual harassment, pre-employment pregnancy tests, unfair dismissal and discrimination on the grounds of pregnancy, and denial of maternity leave and other legally required benefits. Manju in 2015 found that women working in export processing zones in Honduras can earn between 28 and 51% less than the minimum wage, with employers justifying lower wages for women with the stereotype that women's work is less demanding. Some discrimination is overt. For example, we downloaded employment ads from leading websites in a number of emerging markets as part of this research. We first searched for terms such as female and male. We then read candidate ads to be sure they referred to having only male or female applicants. Many globally recognizable multinationals posted ads seeking only men or women for different kinds of positions, which is in clear violation of ILO standards. Now, there have been some recent studies on the gender pay gap in foreign affiliates compared to domestic firms. Vader and Masso find in Estonia that foreign ownership is associated with a substantial increase in the gender pay gap after you control for worker and firm characteristics. They posit that their result may be driven by lower tolerance for flexible work hours among foreign-owned firms. Their results are consistent with those of Bowler et al. In 2018, who showed that the gender wage gap is higher among exporting firms in Norway. Now, in contrast, Javorcek and Abe in 2018 find that foreign affiliates in Japan employ more women and are more likely to provide telecommuting, childcare subsidies, and flexible work arrangements. Tang and Zhang, 2017, suggest that whether or not multinationals exhibit more or less gender discrimination depends on the cultures of the home and the host countries. So we're back to the characterizing it, where the multinational comes from and where it's going. Among Chinese manufacturing firms, they find that foreign affiliates from countries with a more gender equal culture tend to employ more women and appoint female managers. Notably, the UNDP Gender Inequality Index that the authors use to measure home country culture ranks European countries as more equal and the US as less equal than China. So on enforcement, in the 1990s, many multinationals introduced codes of conduct for their suppliers. In today's world, suppliers are often dismissed if they don't improve adherence to codes. At the same time, the literature on supplier adherence paints a complex picture of how often these codes of conduct lead to improvement in supplier behavior. Improvement in behavior is faster if auditors have more training and if audit visits also help train the suppliers. Others find adherence is higher if domestic institutions promote compliance, for example, a free press. In short, codes of conduct do not automatically ensure high compliance. Only with sufficient effort and resources is it possible for multinationals to validate their supplier standards. My co-authors and I believe that meaningful improvements in living standards will require general policies that raise worker productivity and enforce existing laws for minimum wages and ILO standards, including SDG 5. By shifting attention away from multinational status, researchers and policymakers can instead focus on the firm characteristics that really strongly influence wage rates, in particular, the size of the firm and the industrial sector, as well as really important issues of enforcement. Given that multinationals employ only a minority share of the workforce in most countries, Addressing violations of workers' rights at multinationals alone puts a dent in widespread poor conditions. While the marginal returns to activism may be higher for multinationals, solely focusing on them is unlikely to address the full issue of exploitation. Going forward, it will be important to continue holding multinationals to internal and external standards, but improving the welfare of vulnerable workers will require much more than pressure on multinationals, focusing on the nurturing of human capital, creating healthy workspaces, encouraging the function of labor markets, reversing the downward trends in unionization rates, increasing efforts to prevent and enforce rights violations are critical. Now, before I conclude, I just want to make two additional points. If the UN and countries do decide to target multinationals, focusing on those firms in the best position to be able to share profits would make a lot of sense. My own research on anti-sweatshop activism with Jason Skorse, targeted at apparel companies, shows that activism was successful in Indonesia in raising wages and increasing minimum wage enforcement for large multinationals. The reason it was successful and didn't lead to employment declines or massive shutdowns is because workers in those factories were originally earning less than workers in multinationals in other sectors. Also, the companies were making large profits, enough to be able to share, to profit share. So that would suggest targeting highly profitable companies, not those that can barely pay minimum wages. My second point is about the importance of investing in enforcement of existing regulations. When I worked in North Africa for the World Bank, what struck me most was how few labor inspectors there were. A large country might have 3 inspectors. Half of all the workers I surveyed through census data were being paid below the statutory minimum wage. So investment in enforcement is absolutely critical going forward. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those insightful comments, Professor Harrison. I'm going to change the situation now, and we're going to move into a dialogue with a large number of participants where I'm basically going to pose a question or two to them, and they're going to have the opportunity to respond to those questions. And so I hope you'll enjoy this. And then after that, we will move into a much more interactive round where you yourself will be able to post your own Q&A and we'll be able to talk to those. I'm going to start, first of all, with Ms. Mariette Wesserman, who's Vice Chancellor of New York University in Abu Dhabi. Let me start with the question: how can organizations such as universities apply positive gender practices across a network of affiliates? NYU, like many large universities, has multinational affiliates in other countries. Are there lessons from your case that would be useful in terms of other universities that have affiliates elsewhere? Ms. Wesserman, love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Professor Lorraine. I'm really thrilled to be speaking in this session on M&Es, and particularly on this topic of whether M&Es can use HR practices to improve gender outcomes in affiliates abroad. And I think you're right. NYU Abu Dhabi, where I have the honor to be the Vice Chancellor, privilege really, an institution I started up many years ago in 2007 and came back to as Vice Chancellor 2 years ago. So let me describe briefly who we are so that I can explain why I think there might be lessons for multinational enterprises and not just universities. NYU Abu Dhabi is a partnership of New York University and the government of Abu Dhabi, the Emirates, the capital emirate of the UAE. Now, NYU, as Lorraine has said, is a massive multinational enterprise in itself. It is a private university with 50,000 students, 7,000 faculty, 19,000 other types of staff, employees, and researchers. We have 3 main campuses, one in New York, the large mothership, NYU Abu Dhabi opened in 2010, and NYU Shanghai opened in 2012. These are smaller universities in their own right within that bigger university. And then along with that, we have 12 other affiliates 2 in the US, in Washington, Los Angeles, 6 in Europe, 1 in Accra, in Buenos Aires, in Tel Aviv, and in Sydney. So the sun never sets on the NYU classrooms, labs, and libraries, which is an interesting idea, or dormitories for that matter. And within that large landscape, which we really built out in the first decade of this century, building on what were essentially a smattering of study away sites in Europe in the old-fashioned model, we became a truly global enterprise, a global network university. It's really challenging, but it's also very interesting. And so within that, NYU Abu Dhabi is itself very multinational, just as the UAE is. And so we have students from 120 countries. They speak 115 languages. Our faculties, our professors come from more than 45 countries. And there is no majority country. The Emiratis who are local here, the Emirati students are only 19%, and that's by design. And by the way, 75% of them are women. Of all our students, 55% are women. Of the Emirati local population here, 75% in our school are women. Now, I would say on the topic at hand that NYU's global reach and its strong brand, a reputational brand that we protect everywhere. It became a really good university. We're ranked something like 25th in the Oxford rankings these days. The Times Higher Ed ranking, sorry. So we became really strong. So we have something to protect. And we use that leverage very intentionally because we're an educational institution. We have values to protect of the liberal arts, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So we use that brand to effect positive change where we can on gender and other issues, certainly in the first place on our own campuses. And we do that by applying NYU's HR policies throughout our network. We don't do it in a bossy way. Obviously, there are different regulatory systems, different jurisdictions and legal frameworks, and we work with that. But we apply the values that we have as best we can on all these areas, such as compensation, benefits, staff advancement and promotion, and especially equal opportunity. And so our Office of Equal Opportunity strives to promote policies that ensure an environment free from discrimination, harassment, retaliation, sexual assault, all these issues that are obviously bred in the bone in an American institution these days, we have to comply with those. And we really create a culture that actively fights against discrimination and harassment based on all these categories, race, ethnicity, national orientation or national origin or passport, gender or gender identity or expression, color, religion, creed, age, ethnicity, disability or veteran or military status, sexual orientation, pregnancy, genetic information, marital status, citizenship status, or any other of these factors that legally we should not be discriminating, not just legally, but just as a matter of humanity. We shouldn't be discriminating on that basis. And NYU has developed these practices for a very long time in New York, and we educate around them. Of course, we work within the legal frameworks, as I've said, but we fight very hard for these values, and we also begin to make sure that we investigate alleged violations and so forth. Where I want to end is that, what really is even more important than these legal conditions, although they're the bedrock in the end for equal opportunity for all, I think it is the way we apply things like family-friendly policies across our network. And this is especially important here in the UAE and at NYU Abu Dhabi. We have a parental leave of a very high order, support for reproductive rights of a very high order, and so on and so forth. Protections of women who are pregnant, and all these issues that are so very important to maintain. And what's really interesting to see, and I think very germane to this conference, is that it's interesting to see local authorities who are pushing in the same direction. The UAE is very progressive on gender in terms of a policy frameworks. So they often look to us and invite us to talk about this. And they've awarded us, a special distinction for being a family-friendly organization that people want to join. And then they troop us out to talk about that, reward it, give us, recognition for it. And in this area, as in many other areas of our worker contracts, which extend also to our contracted worker, the migrant worker, suppliers, I think we have set sort of standards that have made a lot of change, even in organizational culture, and especially multinational organizational culture here in the country. So I think this really can be done. It just takes utter and complete vigilance and a sort of authenticity about one's values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. I just want to take a minute and link Ms. Wesserman's remarks to Professor Harrison's remarks. I think it's nearly 30 some years ago, I first started teaching a course on multinational enterprises. And I taught then and still believe that multinationals that go abroad carry a package with them. Outward foreign direct investment is a package of capital, property, plant, and equipment, financing, technology, and managerial practices. What we're just hearing, I think, from both Professor Harrison and Vice Chancellor Wesserman is the importance of managerial practices with respect to gender. And that a home where the multinational is headquartered may be a very important signal of its ability to carry those practices with respect to gender and diversity into other countries. So I look forward to hearing more as we work through our speakers. We have next, I believe, a video message from Ms. Asa Regnier, who's Assistant Secretary General of the UN and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. So I'm hoping that that video will be able to run next.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank UNCTAD so much, and especially Secretary General Rebecca Greenspan for inviting UN Women to this important panel as part of the 7th World Investment Forum. Achieving transformative policy reforms and change on the ground regarding women's economic empowerment is a collective project. Achieving transformative policy reforms and change on the ground regarding women's economic empowerment is a collective project and effort. Multilateralism is necessary to advance women in the economy. The UN and multinational enterprises must be partners, particularly through business models that align with other efforts to rethink measures of progress, gender equality, and prosperity. I'm very pleased to see UNCTAD's 2021 report showing evidence that the gender equality policies and practices of multinational enterprises actually can lead to spillover effects in local markets. One way we have seen this happen is through supply chains, the disruption of which continues to impact our lives due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. UN Women's own research shows that multinational enterprises can be influential in helping women's enterprises win new businesses. MNEs can do this not only by seeking women's businesses as their own suppliers, but also by contracting their suppliers to incorporate and report on diversity. We know that women's businesses only receive as little as 1% of procurement spend from the private sector, so the potential impact of this practice can be huge. In this regard, UN Women underlines the important role the international community, the UN system, and civil society can play to hold multinational enterprises accountable to their gender equality practices. UN Women also works closely with businesses of all sizes, sectors and industries across the world through the Women's Empowerment Principles. Through the Women's Empowerment Principles, we bring together partners across sectors and industries in a global network of over 20,000 business executives from nearly 6,000 companies across more than 140 countries. A UN Women study of the largest 350 companies in G7 countries, which was launched last week, found that Women's Empowerment Principle signatories actually generally perform better on gender equality than non-signatories. Signatories have a better gender balance in their workforce, more women on boards, executive and senior management positions, and they do have a supplier diversity policy. We monitor progress on the Women's Empowerment Principles, both through qualitative and quantitative data. And although many companies are asking us to hold them accountable, the main pressure actually comes from other stakeholders. For example, from current and potential talent who want to ensure that the values of the company they work for align with their own. Also from consumers who are increasingly aware how their purchasing decisions can make a difference. From business partners who want to ensure that they protect themselves from risks associated with aligning with the wrong partners. And finally, from investors who increasingly use gender-related performance indicators to assess where the largest return on investment is created and where investment risks can be avoided or reduced. This investors' interest has been generated from the acceptance of the so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting requirements in many countries in the world. Today, no company can ignore the gender equality agenda. It's good for business, economies, and society at large. And it helps foster people-centered organizations that are attractive to all stakeholders, consumers, talent, business partners, and investors alike. Thank you very much once again for having UN Women in this discussion.
I appreciate very much this video from the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women on the Women's Empowerment Principles. I'm going to move us now on to our next panelist, Marie-France Paquet, who's Chief Economist at Global Affairs Canada. Ms. Paquet, can I start by asking you a question? What are some of the lessons from Canada on gender policies, both in terms of inward foreign direct investment by foreign MNEs and outward foreign direct investment by Canadian multinationals?
Thank you very much, Professor Eden, and thank you very much to UNCTAD for the invitation and to be part of this great panel. So in terms of gender policies in Canada as they relate to international trade, I'd like to make two main points. One is on data. When have you ever seen an economist who's satisfied with the amount of data they had? And the second point is on the approach to gender policies in Canada. So we need gender disaggregated data in order to conduct good analysis, shed light on inequalities, and develop responsive evidence-based policies. You have heard trade is not gender neutral, but the composition, the industrial composition of an economy, the distribution of labor between men and women across sectors is important, and it will vary from one country to the other. In Canada, we are fortunate enough that our National Statistical Agency provides a wealth of information, disaggregated by gender, but as well as other dimensions to explore diversity and inclusion in Canadian society. They have a dedicated portal called Gender, Diversity, and Inclusion Statistics. So there's already a lot at our fingertips. You'll find themes as business, justice, education, health, income, and more. Statistics Canada can also provide at times gender disaggregated data by custom requests for a number of measures. We are frequent flyers. We're always requesting to push a bit the envelope, try to link data sets together to conduct great analysis. And Statistics Canada is very responsive to our requests, and they're certainly doing their best. But at times, and for particular measures, there are certain indicators that they just cannot either have or release. some indicators related to FDI and multinationals in particular. We don't yet have much in terms of gender disaggregated data in this area. So for example, StatsCan is able to provide us with data on is unable to provide data on the female share of the workforce in Canadian MNEs compared to foreign MNEs in Canada. However, they are able to provide data on the share of women on boards in multinationals, so that we can have. So sometimes when you go to them and you ask a question, you've got to be specific. You might not be able to look at A, but you might be able to look at B if you slightly change your question, then work with them a bit harder. And another point I'd like to make is that when we're interested in gender and inclusion writ large, be it with, let's say, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, new immigrants in the country, women-owned SMEs and all of that, Statistics Canada might have data, but for privacy issues may not be able to release the data to the researcher, which is sometimes disappointing because we know they have something, but they just don't have enough of data points in a certain data set to be able to release it. So that's the first thing. We do need more, and it's by asking and working with them, of course, that we'll be able to make strides in that regard as well. And on the approach, so as part of Canada's export diversification strategy that we embarked on in 2018, so Canada is pursuing an inclusive approach to trade to ensure that the benefits of trade are widely shared, including for women, SMEs, and Indigenous peoples, and I can add also new immigrants as owner or those that run SMEs in Canada. So we launched a very comprehensive approach to analyze these issues. So that's the first thing. You need the data, then you need to do the analysis to understand what might be the barriers, for example, for women owner of SMEs to trade. And knowing that, of course, will allow you to have better programming, as in the Business Women International Trade Program that we run at Global Affairs Canada. So that's one of the things. The other thing, of course, is that we've been conducting GBA analysis, a GBA plus analysis on different agreements, chapters, and whole of agreements in order to understand issues and to try to make changes. So we have dedicated chapters and provision in our FTAs on gender that provide the parties to undertake cooperation activities and increase the understanding of these important issues and try to help remove the barriers to their participation in international trade. We have launched actually in October last year, so October 2020, a gender and trade advisory group. So it has been regular business to have, a discussion with business sectors, activities, business associations about trade negotiations, but it is the first time. So we now formally have a gender and trade advisory group. So I think that's going to prove helpful. We also seek trade and gender chapters in our FTAs with willing partners, right? That's our default option. That's our preferred approach, if you will, building on what we have achieved with Chile in 2017 and with Israel and the European Union in 2018. So in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, if you prefer, member states have introduced new preamble that reaffirms the importance of promoting inclusive values, including gender equality. So we might not have all the same chapters in every agreement, of course, but we start with the first premise, which is we need to do more to ensure that we look at these issues, we understand the barriers, and we try to remove them. And of course, in the context of our Mercosur negotiations, we've been conducting the same type of GBA analysis as we go along, as we negotiate, which actually, when you discuss with the other parties, allows you to make changes in real time, so to speak, to different provisions in a trade agreement. So that is quite interesting. And our one of our big agreement, of course, signed and implemented in July 2020, July 1st, 2020, the Canada, US, and Mexico agreement does contain gender-related provision in the labor, investment, and SME chapters, as well as the So, we try to mainstream gender responsive and inclusive provision across all of our FTAs. And we do conduct, like I said, GBA plus analysis on specific chapters and on agreement. And I do think that you can find on our website such analysis that we have done for the Mercosur agreement and for CUSMA as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Becquet. Fascinating to hear about Canada and all the way that it has been leading in terms of doing a trade and gender strategy and incorporating those into a whole variety of international trade agreements. I hope we can talk more about that later on. I'm going to go back to His Excellency, Mr. Andres Valenciano, Minister of Foreign Trade at Costa Rica, and pick up on the questions now that I'd like to ask him to address. I was really interested to hear you speak, Your Excellency, on talking about the gender equality strategy in Costa Rica. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that works out in terms of investment promotion agencies in Costa Rica. How is the IPA in Costa Rica managing this in terms of fostering gender equality? And perhaps you might give me an example of multinationals and what's going on in multinationals in Costa Rica with respect to gender equality, please.
Thank you, Professor. It's been delightful to hear all the different initiatives from around the world that are happening. And we would like to share what our investment promotion agency has been at the forefront of the gender strategy that I mentioned before. Our investment promotion agency, CINDE, has as one of its main objectives achieving equitable opportunities for women. And that means it's on their indicators. There's people who are actively working on this, and it has been a success because of the partnership with the multinational corporations. We have been very explicit saying that when companies are looking where to invest, we want to make sure that companies who go to Costa Rica are very aligned in their vision in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of gender equality. And that means we have launched a number of initiatives that help close the gender gap in the labor force and occupations and in leadership positions more and more. So for example, CINDE has launched the GET program. It's called the Gender Education and Technology Program, with the goal of promoting careers in STEAM and women's involvement in the knowledge economy. And through this initiative, CINDE has overhauled its agenda of activities to be implemented with companies throughout the last years. And this has been at every level. One is making sure that it is aligned with our national Women's Institute and the Gender Parity Initiative, which is a countrywide initiative. And we want to make sure that we are aligned with those country goals. But at the same time, CINDE has been very explicit of making sure that we're working in three main areas: education, communication, and the entry or re-entry into the labor market. Because we understand that it starts with when women are very young, to make sure that they are able to eventually pursue careers that have been traditionally left out for them. We want to make sure that we are raising awareness, participating in panels, in discussions, in forums, in public events, to gather momentum and make sure that everyone understands that everyone has to play its part. And obviously, the multinational enterprises and the roles of how they are communicating, which population are they targeting, and how they are also incorporating those goals within their indicators and their business models. And this has been also in partnership with, obviously, with educational institutions. For example, another concrete example is the Women in Engineering projects in community service. This has been in partnership with the Arizona State University, which has a campus in Costa Rica, and the multinational companies which are based here. And this initiative basically seeks to inspire women when they are high school students through innovative project-based learning and study plans in which they are also challenged to solve real-world problems with their communities by using science and technology. So finally, another key aspect in the role of CINDE has been consolidating a group of women leaders and allies, basically women who are leading multinational enterprises and local companies, so they can share their experiences, share their strategies, and also speak out to the rest of the country and demonstrate that women are successfully leading companies as they sell their goods and services all around the world. And they also serve as an example to the younger kids who are looking up to women who are breaking new ground. So obviously, we are creating more spaces like this, and our investment promotion agency has been an integral part of this gender equality strategy that we have been pushing from our Ministry of Foreign Trade.
I really appreciate these follow-up remarks on the gender equality strategy in Costa Rica. And it's clear that what you're doing is having an impact. I just learned and want to congratulate you, Mr. Valenciano. Cindy won the UNCTAD Global Investment Promotion Agency Award today at the World Investment Forum. Congratulations. I'll give you a big round of applause for that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an effort by many people who are committed on driving sustainability and making sure trade and investment helps us achieve these other goals that we believe are absolutely critical, not just job creation, but also inclusion and sustainability as a whole.
That's wonderful. It's also wonderful to see that small countries, Costa Rica, Canada, can be leading on the efforts for gender equality here. So thank you very much, Your Excellency, for participating with us today. I'm going to turn us back to our panelists now, and I'm going to invite Ms. Kristen Hull, who's the CEO of NIA Impact Capital in the United States. It's a social investing firm. And I'm going to ask Ms. Hull, would you mind talking to us a little bit about what you think investors can do to promote gender equality? What kind of role and responsibility do investors have here in terms of fostering SDG 5?
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. And I'm just so excited to be here with my esteemed panelists and our other speakers. And just really, I know we're speaking to the choir here and hopefully to all of those that are part of this movement for gender equality. And so what can multinationals do? And in my case, we really look at what can investors do and what is the role of investors to play when it comes to achieving gender equality. And so thank you for the questions. I'll just jump right in and say that the role of investors is quite large. And I feel like I can't say that enough. Our power is significant for achieving change. Banks, our economy, and our financial services all answer to investors. So each time an investor raises their voice for a preference, that generally does create some change. So I'll just start with a few I guess, different ways that we can do this. One is that every dollar in the case of the US and then across the world, every bit of money that's invested or placed in a bank is actually voting for the economy that we want and the world that we want. And so choosing our banking partners that have women in leadership, that create products specifically for women. When that comes to education, sometimes that means taking out a loan for a house or providing money for children's education. We want to make sure that our banking partners really are doing the right thing for women. And then when it comes to choosing investments, the different ways that we can start, I'll just say as an asset manager, that's choosing who is managing your money makes a really big difference. And the Knight Foundation commissioned Harvard to do a study of diversity in asset management, and they actually combined women and people of color together. And when I spoke with Josh Lerner, the author of the study, and I said, well, why are we being combined? And they said they couldn't make a chart without that because we were so small. So women and people of color asset managers make up 1.3% of the 70 children in asset management across the US. And so really voting with your dollar for who is managing your money. And so then looking into at the company level, what are companies doing and what could they be doing and how can investors invest into those companies that are making a difference? So of course, looking at the top, women in leadership. So on the C-suite, as well as on the board of directors. And of course, there's legislation that we're working on in California, across the US as well. We recently passed SB 826 in California that would require at least one woman on the board of directors in the state of California for any companies that IPO or are located here. Of course, that's being challenged in the courts. And yet at the same time, there are about 5 other states that have taken this on and are interested in proposing legislation that's similar. Interesting things that come up in the research, and this shouldn't surprise anybody, but women have to work twice as hard at least to be in some of these positions, as you're often getting a better leadership because of how hard we need to work. So women CEOs, companies with women CEOs often perform better. And then also there's research on women CFOs, so chief financial officers can really make a difference. Then jumping to the board of directors, the minute that you put a woman on a seat of a board of directors, meetings start on time. So we're talking about more efficiency, and women actually read the board packet. And so what happens then? We have some informed decision makers. And isn't that what you want for all of your companies, informed decision makers? Another kind of interesting story when it comes to women sitting on the board of directors, we in general, don't want to vote on something we don't understand. So if this year's numbers don't match last year's numbers, we will ask a thoughtful question about why that is so. Now that makes us unpopular because oftentimes board meetings want to move through the agenda in a quick way because we're getting to cocktail hour at the end. It's been a long meeting, and yet having women on boards of directors can really make a difference. Of course, then we are looking at governance of the companies. And so then just jumping into policies and practices that we need to see in all of our companies. And some of the other speakers spoke about choosing companies in countries that are actually more beneficial to women in policies and practices. So looking at pay gap, can we expose it, mention it, and then can we address it and really make some change there? Also policies and practices, particularly for the US, we're really needing some paid family leave. And not only do we need for women to be able to take time off after they've had a birth of a child or adoption of a child, we also need the men to not only be offered that, we need them to take that as well, so that when it's time for promotions and company culture, we see women and men as similarly both family-minded, and that they can do both. Then we also want to see products and services that are beneficial to women and girls, and then also the testing of those. So I read recently that it was very recent in the US that car dummies that were being tested for crash dummies, they generally choose a 200-pound dummy, and yet that doesn't protect for women and girls that would weigh and much less and be smaller. So thinking about the research and development that companies are doing when it comes to women and girls. And then that also is a way for companies to address a different sector of the market and possibly have additional innovations and additional products and services. So companies are really at their advantage to include this diverse set of thinkers, from the C-suite to the board, all the way down through product management, et cetera. Other ways that investors can make a difference are choosing financial advisors that are women, and then really making sure that every company in their portfolio has some degree of a gender lens. So I'll stop there because there's a lot that investors can do. I think the main message would be that every bit of money is either contributing to the status quo and our incumbent economy, or it is moving us toward gender equality. And so really being conscious of every bit that is invested, so that it's invested into the world that we want to see.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hull, for those really fascinating remarks on social investing and how it can be used to move SDG 5 forward. I'm going to change now and invite Mr. Vic Van Vuren, who's director of the enterprise branch at the International Labor Organization. And I want to go back to Ms. Isabel Durant's original welcoming remarks on the panel, Vic, where she talked about women and the pandemic and how hard the pandemic had been on women relative to men. And I want to ask you, in the middle of that pandemic that is still ongoing, where so many workers have lost their jobs and so many firms face lost profits and possible bankruptcies, there have been really strong pressures to lower labor standards, both by firms who are trying to stay in business and by workers who are trying to keep their jobs. What kind of policies is the ILO recommending be put in place so that we don't have a race to the bottom in labor standards during the current COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you very much. Let me start by congratulating UNCTAD on its excellent report, which certainly guides us in much of our discussion. At the outset, we at the ILO certainly don't see the relaxing of any standards whatsoever. There's many ways to resolve the issues, and it's certainly not by dropping standards and rules. The challenge that women faced before COVID were exceptional in nature and scope, but are now even more acute. And we mustn't think we're only hitting these problems now. And this requires immediate, bold, and transformative responses. During the pandemic, women have suffered disproportionate job and income losses. And as we've heard from many speakers, they've suffered in many areas. There will be 13 million fewer women in employment in 2021 compared to 2019. Even though the projected job growth in 2021 for women exceed that of men, it will be insufficient to bring women back to the pre-pandemic employment levels. Even women who have continued working, they face unprecedented challenges. At home, women were already performing more than 3/4 of all unpaid care work globally. National lockdowns are also putting women at increased risk of gender-based violence. So where to now? The crisis, as devastating as it is, does provide us an opportunity to build forward better. And the ILO in this regard has put forward a human-centered response centered on gender equality. And I'm going to touch on that point of a human-centered response later, because I think there's a dynamic there that we're missing. For that, we need enterprises that actively take on the gender equality agenda for a better normal. MNEs can make a positive contribution to closing the gender gap and can play a vital positive role in achieving gender equality. We don't just want those, and yes, they're good, those who are setting the pace. We need a much bigger and broader scope of companies and enterprises that are coming to the party. In addition to implementing gender equality policies in their own operations, MNEs can also play an important role in using their leverage to promote gender equality among their business partners and in supply chains, where women sometimes comprise up to 80 or 90% of workers. MNEs that invest in capacity building for gender equality in SMEs down their supply chains can significantly increase their contribution to women's empowerment and further strengthen their market position. And we've heard today of host and home countries. Host governments are responsible for creating the necessary enabling environment to encourage MNEs. And in this regard, they play a key role. The requisite policy frameworks for creating an enabling environment need to come from both the host and home countries. And that's where we maintain the standard setting. International labor standards provide a strong foundation for prioritizing gender transformative measures and applying a gender perspective in all crisis responses. It's not only this crisis that we're going to be dealing with, there's going to be something down the road. And so we need to create that platform. Host country governments should strengthen their legislative framework in line with these international standards. However, legislation is not enough. And so we have the ILO MNE declaration that calls on host country governments to create a broader enabling environment. Home countries, they can use the MNE declaration that recognizes their country policies and that can heavily influence company operations abroad. It calls on home governments to encourage their MNEs operating on or sourcing abroad to respect women's rights, including rights concerning gender equality. The declaration also encourages home-host dialogues on issues of mutual concern. But despite all this legal and policy effort, progress has been slow. Therefore, both host and home countries need to actively promote gender equality as a top priority of responsible business. The ILO report, Business Change, Case for Change, surveyed 13,000 enterprises across the world and showed that there are longer term and strategic benefits to the bottom line connected with gender diversity. So we even have a business case that makes sense. Promoting gender equality in the workplace is not only the right thing, but also the smart thing to do. What are some of the next steps that we should focus on? Adopting fiscal and monetary policies, designing economic recovery packages that benefit women, allocating additional resources to address violence against women and girls, inviting business to commit equal pay for work of equal value, zero tolerance against sexual harassment. No amount of progressive legislation can work without meaningful and proactive action from the private sector. There's a lot that can be said, but let me finish by reiterating that human-centered recovery is possible. We need to recognize that women are just not a number on a balance sheet. And that's where we come to the human-centered approach. We must move from taking a mechanistic approach to this challenge and understand that we're talking about grandmothers, mothers, and daughters. They're not machines that can be switched on and off or that can be discarded when you don't need them anymore. It's time for leaders at all levels to take action and move from talking. We've heard many great examples today, words of wisdom, processes and content. But the time has come now to take a big step to scale up and for leaders to take action, both in government and the private sector and in other social enterprises and entities. Thank you. I sound like a preacher. Let me stop there.
Thank you for those remarks that sound like a preacher, but you're preaching to the choir, I think, here, Mr. Van Buren. I appreciate the remarks very much. Let me just make a general remark to everyone that's listening in that I hope you will post your questions for our distinguished panelists in the Q&A boxes, because we have allotted 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so for general Q&A, so that if you have questions for any particular panelist or in general for the group, please post your questions there, and then you'll have the opportunity to have them answered. I'm now going to turn to our next panelist, Ms. Reema Nanavati, who's the head of the Self-Employed Women's Association, SIWA, in India. And I'd like to ask you, Ms. Nanavati, can you explain what multinationals are present in India and give an example of how they partner with or they choose suppliers? And then talk a little bit about the sectors where women entrepreneurs actually interact the most with suppliers, please.
Namaste, and I would like to thank UNCTAD for inviting me to this prestigious panel discussion and giving me a chance to represent the voices of over 1.8 million poor women workers from the informal economy, the members of SEWA. Let me also first put the reality of these workers is that they are the poorest of the poor. Very often their tools are old and worn out, and they hardly have any information about or access to direct market. The employment opportunities available in the informal economy, therefore, are never constant. The changing market trends, the competitions, and the changing policies make them work in multiple sectors as well. Their occupation varies depending on what is more conducive at what point of time. And in such a scenario, the dignity of the workers is often compromised. And that's where I fully agree with Mr. Vic Van Buren saying that we need to bring a human-centered or a woman-centered approach to trade and working with the multinationals. It also therefore ends up in the vicious downfall of drudgery and poverty. Most of these workers are unregistered, thereby leaving them outside the purview of social protection. This is the reality. I'm not trying to paint a gloomy picture. Therefore, to the question that you asked that, where are the workers and where do they work along with the multinationals? But most of these workers form an integral yet invisible part of the global supply chains that are largely driven by the multinational enterprises. Especially we see in our country in the sectors like ready-made garments, waste recycling, agriculture, construction, and food processing. Although they generally form the bottom rung of the supply chain of the global brands, their work is often characterized by small or undefined workplaces, unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, low or irregular incomes, long working hours, and lack of access to finance, training, skills, and technology. I'd like to share an example to explain this. And I was talking to one of our sisters in the city of Ahmedabad. She and her entire family of 4 work as garment workers from their home on piece rate basis. And despite of working for 10 hours per day, they barely earn rupees 12,000 Indian rupees. The fashion keeps changing in the garment industry every 2 months. And therefore, I think she also has to keep upgrading her tools, upgrading her skills, and which forces her to invest in upgrading her tools, her sewing machine, the fittings that are needed. Due to the COVID crisis, she hardly got any work, and therefore she could not even recover the expenses that she had. In fact, she was forced to borrow money even for her daily sustenance. And now she needs to make adjustments to the machines because, once the work has restarted, the fashion has again changed. So where does she get the trainings? Where does she get the upgrading of the tools? And with so much of debt mounting on her, even for her own survival, so it's like a double-edged sword. And I think the pandemic has completely eroded the earnings, the savings, the assets, the education of the girl child, and women are under tremendous stress and violence. The informal sector women workers are normally, therefore, at the very bottom end or outside the supply chain, working as subcontract workers. They have no formal contracts, no social protection, no minimum or living wages, and no access to skill building. Normally what we see in our country, the multinationals use their foundations or the corporate social responsibility funds for trainings and use the documentation in their labels, because in the European countries and in some of the other countries, you now ask for a green label or you ask for certain kinds of certification, and also in the promotional material that how they are directly empowering the women who produce the goods that they are selling. But I think what is really needed in terms of partnership is partnering in the risk mitigation, the climate shocks that these women workers are completely facing, and the market shocks. And I think the best answer that I see is that what is needed is a livelihood recovery and a resilience fund. If the multinationals cannot integrate these workers higher into the value chain, at least they should contribute towards this livelihood recovery and resilience fund, which would help mitigate these workers during the climate crisis or the market shocks. And the last thing is that when these workers organize into their own collectives or cooperatives or federations or their own enterprises, they build local decentralized supply chains, which are far more adaptable, which are far more resilient to these kind of shocks. And it is with these kind of aggregators that the multinationals need to work with, need to partner with in transfer of systems and processes, in terms of transfer of skills or in building their competencies, so that we are able to integrate the workers, especially the women workers, higher into the value chain. So I would just end here and thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Nanavati, for those important remarks about women entrepreneurs and how they can work with multinationals and then foster the transmission of gender policies throughout developing countries. Very helpful. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Anna Gesmes, who's chief of the Gender Affairs Division at ECLAC, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'd like to ask you, please, we know that the 14th Regional Conference on Women in Latin America and the Caribbean, which was held last year, agreed on some innovative recommendations on gender and investment. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about those, please.
Thank you, Professor Lorraine, and good morning from Chile. And thank you and congratulations to UNTAD for this important high-level panel. No? Let me start saying that in this year, the region experienced the largest GDP contractions in the last century. In fact, is the region most affected for the COVID pandemic, with a strong impact on the gender inequalities, and women were the more affected. According to our figures, women are overrepresented in unemployment, informality, poverty, and caring, the workload on unpaid domestic and care work. And 60% of the employment of women in the region were concentrated in sectors at high risk of being affected by a pandemic, such manufacturing, domestic, work-based, and tourism. So this is only a preamble, but I would like to talk about the regional conference, as Professor Eden said. The regional conference on women in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a milestone, I think, because for more than 4 decades, ECLA's member states, with feminist movement, with international organization, discussed and adopted a comprehensive and progressive regional gender agenda in which women's autonomy and rights are at the core of sustainable development. In the last regional conference in Santiago, we adopted the Santiago's commitment in Chile, the 14th regional conference, and we discussed the investment and trade trends and agreed an innovative policy commitment to reorient the FDI, foreign direct investment, towards the goals of gender equality and sustainability. One example on that is that governments from the region agreed to conduct assessment on the impact of human rights of trade and investment policies and agreement from a gender equality perspective. This is very important, and let me mention the trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay in 2016 that marked a milestone, as it was the first agreement to contain a specific chapter on gender and trade. And the parties undertake to implement international convention on gender equality in areas such as equal pay, maternity protection, work-life balance, etc. No? We have now new agreement between European Union and countries, the NAFTA, so important. So this is very important for this region. Of course, it's crucial to recognize that in an interconnected world, the possibility to advance this agenda by specific countries is limited. There is need of regional and international coordination to avoid the race to the bottom and move towards a race to the top. Costa Rica is a key leader in the UN multilateral fora with ECLA and with other countries in the region to promote this idea and interconnectivity. No? In this conference, the governments also agreed to operate in a coordinated manner at the regional level and avoiding harmful competition among countries to prevent taxation, wage cutting, and gender inequalities being used as adjustment variables to increase exports and attract investment. This is very strong commitment to align investment policies with women's rights framework. It is important to recall that according to ECLA's FDI last report in Latin America, FDI projects experiences a rebound between September and February of this year. However, it appears that a new drop occurred in the value of the announcement made. It's difficult that the region could increase by more than 5% in this year. So it's important to recognize that FDI must be channeled towards activities that generate greater productivity, innovation, and technology, and contribute to the development of dynamizing sectors, which are the sectors that help to promote a transformative recovery with gender equality in the region. Just to illustrate this sector, we are talking about healthcare, manufacturing industry, digital economy, care economy, sustainable tourism, that is very important in the region. And let me mention that a very critical issue in Latin America and Caribbean, that is the connectivity and the digitalization, because in the region, 4 in 10 women do not have internet access or can afford connectivity in the context of this platform. For that, we are promoting, under the leadership of Chile, the Regional Alliance for Women's Digitalization in Latin America and the Caribbean, which represent a commitment to reduce the digital gender gap in the region and promote the construction of a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable post-COVID future. Finally, ECLAC, with the member states at the regional conference, is calling for a transformational recovery with gender equality and sustainability on the core. So besides, this is important that contribute to generation of new jobs and opportunities and economic autonomy for women, especially in emerging sectors of the economy. And of course, reduce the feminization of poverty that is a trend in our region. This is a possibility, and we are working towards the next conference that will be on Argentina next year. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear about all the activities going on at ECLAC, at CPAL, in terms of gender-related activities. Thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Henriette Kolb, who's head of the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group at the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank. And Ms. Kolb, I'd like to ask you, what insights would you like to share on sourcing by multinationals from women-owned enterprises and supply chain strengthening? We heard from Ms. Nanavati at India about the formation of women entrepreneur groups and how important she thought that would be. And I wonder, could you talk about it from the point of view of the IFC, your views on the linking between multinationals and women entrepreneurs, please?
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And Ankta, thank you to all of you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about sourcing. But really from an investor perspective and linking it back to Kristen's remarks, what can investors do? We embed our work on gender equality as an investor really in the pyramid, I would say, of stakeholder engagements. When we invest about 30 billion per year in emerging markets, we enable our clients to close key gender gaps. So leadership, the workforce, on the customer side, on the supply chain, and then in the community. And the supply chain, I think, is the one that's been the most sticky and the most tricky one for a number of reasons. And some of these reasons have been mentioned earlier in our discussion. One being a lack of sex disaggregated data. The second one is that corporate buyers oftentimes find it hard enough to actually link into a supply chain that is safe and compliant with the local regulations or international regulations. The third one is that women entrepreneurs themselves are concentrated, and Rima said that so very well, often in the informal sector, very much outside value chains, and so quite overwhelmed in terms of how to link up into corporate buyers with certain procurement requirements. So for many reasons, the supply chain part is a sticky one, also because we know that roughly women entrepreneurs around the world lack 41% in working capital in terms of scaling their businesses. So the World Bank Group and IFC included, we decided let's start at home, because as an investor, you're more credible in your market if you actually walk the talk. And so about 3 years back, we did an analysis within the World Bank Group on our own procurement spend. How much are we sourcing around the world from women-owned, led enterprises? And what we found was saddening, but also not too surprising. We on average source about 3.7% from women-owned and led businesses. Now, you've heard earlier in the video address by Asna that actually on average, large corporations spend only about 1% on women entrepreneurs. So we came out slightly better, but clearly still very dismal. But the point was we did the analysis and we then publicly put out a target and committed to doubling that. So where are we at? In fact, we made good headway in the first year after the commitment and COVID hit. And so our own statistics internally bear out that actually we lost some momentum that we had gained in the previous year, and we actually had a drop in the sales. And so the procurement actually has been stalled. However, now we are actually making very good headway in reaching our doubling target by 2023, and we're confident we can get there and then scale from there. So that's on the internal side, and taking Vic's point on making sure this is really leading to action, the conversation today, I encourage everyone who's tuned in, the panelists as well as the audience, to perhaps think, what can you spend differently and more inclusively? That could be in your household, in your community, at the city level, and of course in the private sector itself. It's doable, and if you want any support and guidance, we have also a value chain diagnostics tool that we'd be more than happy to share with you, so reach out. Now, very briefly, spending a couple of minutes on what does that mean in the markets. So we've launched a global program called Sourcing to Equal. We've started it in Kenya, but we're rolling out into several other countries. And what it aims to do is really, I would say, three core things. One is to build the capability of women entrepreneurs to supply. And that's centered, as I call it, on the 6 C's, if you wish, and really look at support there. Capacity, capital, community, care, connectivity, and contracts. So those 6 C's really have to be put in place to holistically support women entrepreneurs into being able to consistently sell and meet the supply chain requirements. Then the second pillar of the program is to work with corporate buyers. And those are really our IFC's investment clients, where we can go in and say, we can help you to analyze and disaggregate what you spend on tier 1 and ideally in tier 2 in the supply chain, because there's very few women entrepreneurs at the tier 1 level in most cases, and really help you to understand what's your baseline and then help you grow from where you're currently at to a target that you would like to set for yourself. And you don't need to do that alone. We actually convene a peer learning, and that's what we're doing in Kenya, of many, many companies together where we really scale this work. And then the third one, which is really the vital one, is to link that back to financial institutions and increase supply chain finance and working capital support with a gender lens. So it's early days. It's too early to share impact statistics and results with all of you, but I hope you follow our journey along and join us in finding out whether we are being able to increase the procurement spend in Kenya and beyond. I would just like to close my very brief remarks in saying that the C I mentioned, one of the 6 C's, the care part, is the other element that's really vital in the Building Back Better agenda. And it's something that corporate buyers can certainly help with, both for the informal and the formal workforce. Supporting working parents with childcare solutions makes an enormous difference in the productivity and the work satisfaction and retention of workers, but also actually to company results. And if you're curious as to, is that true? Please check out IFC's Tackling Childcare website, where we have company-specific and sector-specific research that highlights the business benefits that employers draw from providing affordable, safe, and tailored childcare solutions to their working parents at the country level. I leave it at that. I know we don't have a ton of time and we want to hear from the audience. Back to you, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kabulos. Important remarks on what's going on at the International Finance Corporation and how it's fostering women in development. Let me turn now. This ends our second segment of our program with individual questions to the panelists. And I'm going to go back now for a minute and ask a question to Ms. Durant, to Deputy Secretary General Durant, on the role of UNCTAD in making sure trade and investment can help advance the position of women in the economy. Mr. Ent, would you like to share your thoughts with us, please, on this important topic?
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine, for that. And thank you to all the panelists regarding the interesting and passionate initiative experience from different horizons, private sector, government, etc. So I think that it shows that a lot of things are done in at different levels. But in addition to the analysis, the data, and I insist, of course, on data and especially disaggregated data, as it was said by several speakers, and that UNCTAD is really trying to work and to contribute to that, I would like to insist on one aspect. We know so well the crucial importance for a lot of developing countries on FDI, and they really would like to attract FDI because it's key in the potential recovery process for them. So it's true that we agreed, all of us, on the importance of gender equality, gender balance in MNEs globally and through different lens, training, etc., etc. We agree on that. But looking at the FDI and the necessity for the developing countries to attract this FDI, for instance, in infrastructure, which is key for development and especially to address climate change adaptation. Infrastructure, FDI, companies in this sector are probably less important regarding gender equality and especially the representation of women in this sector. The same for all the digital sector, the STEM, science and technology, which is so important now. I think that the big consultancies firms, or even in some sectors related to big data, the big GAFA, are not really gender balanced in their composition. So I think that we have really to have a reinforced monitoring or highlight or vigilance, because I think that in this period of recovery, we know how important it is for recovery to have this gender balance in MNEs. But maybe it could be the opposite, which could happen because of the recovery or the risk of the pandemic consequences. Last issue that I would like also to highlight is the board of MNEs. In the board of MNEs, the representation of women is very, very low. And I think that's also something that we can try to mobilize our energy where we are, all of us, in our different capacities, to really insist on the importance to have a board, even if it's a private board, which is gender balanced, because I think that it could change also a lot in the strategy of the MNE globally if the board is more gender balanced than it is the case today. So that's also something that we can look at. So just to let you know that UNCTAD is really totally committed to do more in order to analyze the FDI regarding the gender balance approach. We are doing that also in the investment review that we are doing regularly, trying to look at this aspect of gender balance. It's also the case in a lot of other initiatives, not really related to investment, but also in different parts of the work of UNCTAD, and especially in the gender dimension of the trade agreement. And that's why I was really interested to listen to the Canadian partner, because we know that we are doing a lot together, trying to increase the possibility to have disaggregated data for really trade agreement which could be more balanced, and not only with a chapter in the trade agreement, but more than a chapter, something which is monitored, which is really concretely on the ground implemented and controlled and monitored. If it is just some sentences, it's nice, but it's not enough. So count on us to continue to work on that, gender disaggregated data, review of all the STI and foreign investment agreement that we can really help to insist on the gender balance. But we have also to be enough alerted on the risk that the pandemic and the recovery could really not be helpful in order to pay attention enough at this issue, because we know how important or crucial it is for a lot of countries, and maybe the attention could be a little bit less important on these issues in order to really promote or attract investment on very short term, because it's absolutely key. So it's why we have to be really alerted on that. That's what I wanted to tell you. And for sure, all the partners, be sure that it's not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of the stuff, the beginning of a part of the way in the thing that we have to do together. And I hope that very soon we can continue this discussion, because it's of course something where we have to share our various experience from different lens horizons, as it was the case today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Durant. We're honored by your presence today and really appreciate these important remarks that set the agenda for us for the next at least 5 to 10 years, I think. So thank you very much. In this last segment of our high-level panel, I like to encourage you, the audience, if you have questions, to please post them in the chat. I'm actually going to start with one general question to the panelists, and I'll try to go in the same order we did, knowing that some of our panelists unfortunately have had to leave us, and ask a general question. If you could recommend only one policy change that multinationals should adopt, which you think would actually improve women's empowerment, what would that policy change be that you think multinationals should adopt? And I'm going to start with Ms. Paquet, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Eden. So actually, let me start by setting the scenes for the context in Canada, and to follow up on Ms. Durant's intervention about women on a board of directors. So in Canada, women represent 18.3% of all directors on board. I would say only 18.3%. So surely we can do much better than that. And as other panelists have shown or demonstrated, to do so would actually increase, it would be beneficial for the corporations themselves and therefore for the economy, right? So there's a greater share of women on board of directors in Canadian MNEs compared to foreign MNEs in Canada. Okay, so that's interesting. And there's about the same share of women on board of Canadian MNEs compared to domestic Canadian firms. And then we look at our partners doing business in the country. What we see is that French-owned corporations in Canada had the highest share of women on their boards, with 20.5% compared to 18.3%. Okay, for Canadian MNE. So that is interesting. Now, these are just raw data, and they're not like a proper econometric analysis, as Professor Harrison talked about, controlling firm characteristics and worker characteristics, right? But it does point out to some kind of good questions in our own context, and it begs the question: why is it so? What is it, so special about those French-owned corporations if they have so much more women on their boards? So in terms of government intervention, of course, we cannot dictate what private companies are doing, but we can certainly encourage them, and previous governments have done so, to try to entice corporations by highlighting the benefits of having more women on their boards to do better in that regard. And I think that is something that we can do. Now, the government in different high-level positions, senior management position, has strived to appoint more women, right, to set the example once again, right? So, for example, in our head of missions, our ambassadors posting, they try to have, gender balance whenever they can, when it, it does make sense, to appoint enough women as ambassadors. And again, it's just to set the stage and say, we believe it's important. This is what we, as the government, the federal government, can do, and this is what we're doing. So I think we can encourage companies, put them to the task, the challenge, if you will, to have more women for their own benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paquet. I'm going to turn now to Professor Harrison and ask Professor Harrison the exact same question. If you can only recommend one policy change that MNEs adopt to move women's empowerment forward, what would you recommend?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Eden. That's a great question. I want to separate, as I did in my remarks, what you can do in the home country where you're coming from versus in the host country where you're going to. And in the home country, I'm going to echo a lot of what's been said by Marie-France and by others about the importance of leading by example, and in particular, appointing women to boards. I completely agree is absolutely critical. We have a long way to go. and leading by example in terms of appointing women to senior roles. And I mean, at this point, I would really like to expand it to not just women, but what we call in the United States, underrepresented minorities. So for example, when I first became the dean at Berkeley Haas 3 years ago, the first thing I did was change the representation. I transformed our board. I appointed women. I appointed underrepresented minorities. I did the same thing with my senior leadership, my chief financial officer. I mean, that is what we need to do. It needs to start at the very top. So that's what I would encourage the home countries, the source countries to do. In terms of the host country, so where a lot of industrial country multinationals are going to, I would return to my early remarks about enforcement. I mean, so many countries have laws that look great on the books, but there's zero enforcement or very poor enforcement or weak enforcement. So I really think that we need to think about not just the laws we pass, but how we enforce them. And that's true for another issue that was raised, I think, by Rima on this call of, the importance of sustainability. What we're seeing is that the most disadvantaged are also bearing the biggest costs of climate transformation. And so putting in policies in host countries that are then implemented through increased enforcement on the area of gender and sustainability would be absolutely critical.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Kristen Hull and ask you the same question, please.
So thanks for the question. And I'm just going to echo some of the previous comments and maybe just fill in. We need women at the top. We need them just at the top. So I would say, requiring them on boards, whether that's a quota system or however we get there, incentivizing companies to have them. And then, of course, in senior leadership. And then what will we get? We'll get more of the policies that we've spoken about on this panel. So in the US, we're really needing to dismantle and do away with forced arbitration in employee contracts. And so as it's highly associated with sexual harassment and racial discrimination, and of course, if women and underrepresented minorities are suffering in the workplace, they're not able to advance. They're suffering different types of discrimination. So having more women at the top and in decision-making roles is going to help us with, reducing, if not completely eliminating, the pay gap, getting rid of antiquated policies like forced arbitration that prohibit advancement and prohibit a positive and inclusive company culture. So that I'm sticking with that one. Let's go with women at the top for 300.
I like it. Let me turn now to Mr. Vic Van Buren and ask you the exact same question, please, Vic. What would you recommend?
We need to mainstream gender measurement indicators into company performance. We in the measurement of the success of a company over the years, we look at the economic components only, and the time has come where we need to measure the social, both the economic and the environmental factors. And so we need to look at indicators that will determine whether a company's success has been met by what they're going to reach in terms of gender equity and all the different factors. There's no one size that fits all. Industries will vary from one to the other. Some have got many women, some don't. Some have women at the higher level, some don't. But those indicators must be transparent and must be able to determine whether they've been successful or not. And I don't believe it should be part of a corporate social investment glossy report at the end of the year where you show some pictures of, fixing a bit here and a bit there. I'm talking about mainstreaming it into the core of the business. Once we do that, it will get the necessary attention and necessary action and movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Nanavati, please, and ask for what would you recommend multinationals do?
I think it's a good question, and we all talk, whether it's the multinationals, that we all like to work with the aggregators, but when will the time come when we start engaging with the micro and the tiny enterprises who really do the production and who really take on the burden and the brunt of the climate, crisis, or for that matter, any other crisis that come. And the second is that it is time that the multinationals also, partner with the women-owned enterprises and, work in partnership. You share your profits and you share the risks as well. And what I mean to say by aggregators is that everybody likes to engage at the meso level, but the bulk of the producers, the bulk of the workers are at the very, very micro level. And I think the time has come when we talk about new economic pathways that one will have to look at processes, one will have to look at rebuilding systems, which will help us in engaging with the tiny and the micro enterprises. Otherwise, I don't think we will be able to solve the challenge of poverty. And as we are always, telling at SEVA that poverty, therefore, is also a form of violence with the consent of the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now turn to Ms. Anna Gesmes and ask you the same question. Ms. Gesmes, what would you recommend multinationals adopt?
Yes, it was very inspiring to hear Mrs. Duran to talk about the gender parity and gender participation at all decision levels. I think parity is a key mandate for the regional conference, not only at the political level, but also at the social level, of course, in the M&Es. This is very, very important, not to have more women making decisions. Secondly, we need to move from commitment to concrete and transformative actions. It's necessarily that M&E develop gender mainstreaming plan according to human rights standard to contribute to protect, respect, and fulfill the economic rights and women's rights. But let me say that mainstreaming is not enough. We need very clear affirmative action. For instance, as I mentioned before, promoting the digitalization of women and the participation of women in the STEM. So mainstreaming is too slow. We need very clear and transformative action on that, or to eliminate the gender gap. That is a big violation of women's rights across the world, the pay gap. And so the idea is to promote the clear participation of women's and women's economic participation, but also to end violence against women in M&Es and to promote care systems and care economy also. So the idea is how to use this crisis and an opportunity for the recovery with transformation, with transformative action, putting the gender equality and sustainability on the center of M&E efforts, of government efforts, and in general at national and at global level. So this is very inspiring moment for us and challenging also.
Thank you very much. And to finish up with our comments on this question, I'd like to turn now to Ms. Henrietta Cobb at the IFC and ask the same thing. If you could recommend one policy changes for multinationals, what would that recommendation be?
Since I'm the last one, I'd be cheating. I picked 3. One that everyone agreed on, which is women at the top. We've seen in our own research that actually having gender balanced and more equality at the top leads to, yes, financial performance that's better, but also better ESG compliance and outcomes, as well as actually safer workplaces. So on the gender-based violence and harassment agenda, we've seen that grievance mechanisms are being much better followed through, and there is more safety at work. So definitely that's number 1. Second one, until we get there, which I don't want to be doomsday, but I think it'll take a little time. I think to Vic's point, we need corporate scorecard targets that are part of the business KPIs. So it's not a standalone framework that's sort of a hobby you pick up eventually, but it really has to be integrated. And IFC, I would say, is really quite a leader in that front. We have 4 corporate scorecard commitments on how much we have to increase volume deployed to women specifically, how we're getting to 50% of our own equity investments to be women on boards and so on. So corporate scorecard is number 2. And then the last one is we need to bring climate and gender more closely together in the conversation and use public and private markets to achieve better outcomes, because that will be the only way for a better future, I think, for all of us. Back to you.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for one more question. And so I'd like to pose this question, and it's, you know, it's important. It's October 2021, and we are still in the middle of the pandemic here. Given the negative impacts that COVID-19 has had and is having on women, what can multinationals do to offset these negative impacts? What can governments do? And I'm going to go back through our panelists and ask them to ask, what can be done to help preserve the role of women during the pandemic? And I'm going to start with Ms. Paquet, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, what we found in Canada, and you know, we've been running surveys at a very regular interval during the pandemic, and we're still doing it, but a bit more spread apart in terms of business conditions. And what we've seen is that women, as owner of SMEs in this case, not MNEs, but SMEs, were much quicker at laying off their staff at the beginning of the pandemic, and were shy to take advantage of the government programs offered. So that was very interesting to me. And it took a few months into the pandemic really to see women-owned SMEs take advantage of the government programs, the different programs we had for helping out with the workers' salary and real estate and all these things. So it took them a while. So the key here, I think, is information. Sometimes the risk perceived by women might be different. So you need to tell them, don't hesitate to reach out to get advantage of, try to take advantage of the programs if they're there. Don't be shy to try. If you're not eligible, someone will let you know, right? And if something is not filled out properly, they will let you know as well. So I think we've seen that at the beginning. So it took time for women-owned SMEs to take up said programs. But what we've seen later on in the pandemic is that their increase of online sales has increased by more than 80% compared to average SME in Canada. So it took them a bit of time to adjust to the crisis, so to speak. They've managed to take advantage of programs and they've bounced back very well. Okay, so we're not back to pre-pandemic level in all sectors of activities, of course, right? But we definitely see that. So I think there's a perception of risk that might be different sometimes by women, and we need to maybe provide a lot of information to help them out. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to turn to Ms. Hull for her remarks.
Thank you for this. And so, oh my gosh, so much we can do. I'm just seeing this time as a time of where we can, I guess we're saying in the States, build back better. And how can we do that in the most inclusive way? So really noticing all of the issues from the pandemic, from the past year and a half, how women have been carrying the household, our families, and our entire economies, in some ways. And so looking at both recognizing that and then really building in structures so that we're accommodating what it means to be in balance in our economy and then, of course, in our families. And that means promoting the women here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Van Vuren, your thoughts. What can we do in the pandemic?
Sorry, I'm just unmuting here. Yeah, I think there's lots of things one can do, but I would like to think that we should treat women like I would want my wife, my daughter, and my mother to be treated with dignity, respect. Treat them as human beings in this human-centered approach and support them in attaining their respective goals and reaching their career aspirations. That's what we need to do. We need to not, as I said, treat them like a balance sheet number. And if we can bring that in, it will make their lives so much better during these difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. Cobb next because I know she has to go, if she has some thoughts to share about the pandemic.
I think one part that I would like to safeguard for MNEs is the conversation around mental health. I think in many countries around the world where mental health is more of a taboo, slow inroads have been made during the COVID pandemic. I think it's been becoming more normalized to talk about mental health support for employees. And I think if we could get much more effective at building robust mental health systems at the workplace and in the community and invest more collectively into that space, I think that would be absolutely terrific. Because we've seen not just youth struggling incredibly with depression and suicide thoughts and so on, but also workers really struggling, in particular women with mental health crisis. So that's the one area that I think collectively I would like us to work harder on.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cobb. Can I last turn then to Ms. Gesmes and ask what you think from ECLAC's perspective should be done for women in the pandemic?
Thank you, Professor. I think first of all is put gender equality and women's economic empowerment and women's economic autonomy on the core of the recovery plans of the governments and entrepreneurs. To advance a transformative recovery with gender equality is key to increase the participation of women entrepreneurs and workers in knowledge-intensive sectors and in higher ranking position in regional and global production chains to guarantee labor rights for women workers in the context of the digital economy, prioritizing the development of digital skills, and to ensure access to quality financial services and products and access for women-led businesses to public procurement. Transformative recovery with gender equality requires a productive recovery with women's economic participation, inclusive digital transformation, a fiscal path for gender equality, and very, very important, and this is the core of our work for the next year, the care economy as a driving and care society as a driving force to move forward a care society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes our session, and I just want to take a word and say thank you very much. I'm honored to have moderated this panel and just say, when I was a child growing up in Canada, my mother was on the first Status of Women Commission for the province of New Brunswick, which I think was the first Status of Women Commission in Canada. And so I grew up in a network focused on women's empowerment. And I wish that for all women and girls all over the world. And thank you so much for inviting me to share with these amazing individuals who are fostering the cause of SDG 5. Let me finish now. I'm going to turn the floor to Emilia Santos-Paulino, who's Chief of Investment Issues at the Division on Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD, for a wrap-up of this session.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. I will not go into a full summary because the discussions were so insightful, so rich, but I will highlight key issues that are important for our research agenda going forward, because this is not a one-off show. We started this year with the launch of our report, as DSG Duran said, but we continue. Every year we have our flagship publication, the World Investment Report, where we started a few years ago already analyzing the trends in terms of transparency and in terms of reporting by multinational enterprises. So we are taking all your insights on board, and we look forward to continue working with you. I thank you all, distinguished panelists, for your fantastic contributions. I am particularly honored to have had representatives from all across our stakeholders community today, and this has made our task ahead more important. I am also grateful to His Excellency Andres Valenciano and Professor Anne Harrison for their keynote address. As I said, I will not go through all the issues, but there are some important highlights here that I would like to reinforce. The issue of policies, but not only policies for the sake of policies, but enforcing those policies and regulations. This matters in this discussion. And we have to think ahead and beyond public policies and focusing also on managerial and human resources, as we heard from different panelists today, including procurement policies for enterprises and for the government. And this is also important in the context of trade agreements and bilateral investment agreement. We also discussed that the transmission of positive gender policies and norms can be advanced through international standards and through the global policy environment for investment. And again, here I would like to echo the issues raised by our panelists, especially through trade and investment agreements. From a corporate perspective, for us, international reporting standards are key to driving a positive impact. Transparency is not only for the public sector, private sector transparency also matters. As I said earlier on, this year, for example, in the World Investment Report, we show that multinational enterprises are more and more adopting policies on diversity and inclusiveness, and not only in developed countries, also in developing countries. According to our data, we see that this trend is growing in emerging markets, in developing countries. This attention to gender equality, which we proxied in your analysis by the existence of a diversity policy, for example, or a female-oriented policy. So as we saw, this trend in developing countries is increasing, where the number of such policies doubled in the last 5 years. There are important countries like Costa Rica, South Africa, that have interesting data. But this, we have to bear in mind that some of these issues are very much developed country issues. Reporting rates are influenced by home country attention to gender issues, advanced countries like Canada, like the Netherlands. Which also we have the case where disclosures are required by stock markets. So companies are required to report. And also the visibility and size of the company, which affects the exposure to consumer and to stakeholders' pressures. So for this, data matters, and we look forward to continue analyzing these issues. For a change, and for change, we heard that we need to start at the top, executives, senior leadership, in terms of action. Let's work on the top 100, top 500, top 5,000, and so on. But for us, from a development perspective, and as we heard from the panel today, we need to move the analysis beyond the board and also do analysis down the labor market chain to the middle and lower levels workers, including informal ones. And we are grateful to have a representative here today speaking on that, in addition to our colleague from ILO. We also heard that regional cooperation matters, thanks to ECLAT and to Canada for that, especially to avoid a race to the bottom. So thank you so much. This is also important, as we heard from Madame Duran, not only from the investment perspective, but also from the trade and from the technology perspective. So I will finish by saying that with all the insights we gathered today in mind, at UNCTAD with our initiatives and more to come in terms of research on FDI and MNEs, in terms of new research on SMEs, and tomorrow I invite you to join 2 panels that we have on the internationalization of small and medium enterprise. We will continue fostering a gender-sensitive approach in trade and investment, in national and international policy making, but above all, in all our research through the World Investment Report and through our academic journal, the Journal of Transnational Corporations. I will stop here and thank again to all our panelists. Thank you, Lorraine, for such a competent moderation of a very high level panel. And I look forward to continue discussing with you around the table today, different levels in terms of consensus building research and dissemination of our work. Thank you very much. And thank you to our own wonderful audience for posting questions and for giving us feedback through the chat function. Thank you very much.